There is a conversation happening right now, somewhere, in which one person believes they are simply talking, sharing opinions, filling silence, being social, while the other person is quietly collecting everything they need to know. No interrogation. No visible method. No moment the first person could point to afterward and say, "That is when I was asked." The information moved across the table naturally, the way water moves, not because it was pulled, but because the conditions were right for it to flow. This is elicitation, and it is among the most precise and least understood influence disciplines in existence. Most people approach information gathering the way they were taught to, with questions. Direct, clearly framed, sequentially logical questions that announce their purpose the moment they arrive. This approach works in contexts where the other person is cooperative, motivated to share, and has no investment in managing what you receive. It works in surveys, in intake forms, in conversations between people who have already decided to be transparent with each other. It fails, consistently, and often invisibly, in every other context. Because the moment someone recognizes that they are being questioned, they stop being a person in a conversation and become a person managing an impression. What you receive after that point is not information. It is a performance optimized for your perception of them. The fundamental insight behind elicitation is this: people do not guard what they do not perceive as targeted. The defensive architecture of the human mind is triggered by the perception of extraction. The felt sense that someone wants something specific from you, that your words are being collected rather than received. Remove that perception, and the architecture doesn't engage. The information remains accessible, ambient, present in the natural texture of conversation. What elicitation does is create the conditions under which sharing feels like a social act rather than a transfer, so that the person gives you what they actually know instead of what they've decided you should have. This distinction between what someone actually knows and what they've decided to give you is the entire territory elicitation operates in. Intelligence professionals call the gap between those two things the disclosure differential. It exists in every significant conversation, and its size varies with the stakes the other person perceives. Low-stakes conversations have small differentials. People share relatively freely because they don't feel monitored. High-stakes conversations, or conversations with someone whose judgment matters, produce large differentials. The person is curating constantly. Elicitation is the discipline of collapsing that differential without the other person registering that it has collapsed. The first mechanism is the false assumption, and it is the most immediately effective tool in the elicitation framework. The structure is straightforward. You introduce an incorrect premise about a domain the other person has genuine knowledge of, stated with confidence, as though you already believe it. You are not asking. You are asserting incorrectly, specifically, with enough conviction that the error is impossible to leave uncorrected for someone who knows better. The human drive to correct misinformation is among the most consistent behavioral responses available to an elicitor. It is social, it is reflexive, and critically, it does not feel like disclosure. It feels like assertion. The person correcting you is not answering a question. They are establishing the record. And in doing so, they reveal not just the correction, but the depth of their knowledge, the confidence of their position, and often the emotional investment that caused them to engage at all. The architecture of the false assumption works on several levels simultaneously. At the surface level, it produces a correction that contains the information you needed. At a deeper level, it produces unsolicited elaboration. Because people who are correcting a misconception don't stop at the bare minimum. They explain, they provide context. They give you the reasoning behind the correction, because leaving you with only the correct fact feels incomplete when the wrong mental model might reassemble itself without sufficient support. This elaboration is where the most valuable information lives, not in the corrected fact, but in what the person considers necessary context for understanding why the fact is what it is. That context reveals how they think about the subject, what they consider significant, and what their internal model of the situation actually looks like. There is a calibration required to use the false assumption effectively. The error must be wrong enough to require correction, but not so wrong that it signals incompetence on your part, because if you appear too uninformed, the other person may simplify their correction rather than expand it. The target zone is the plausible misconception, something a reasonably informed person might genuinely believe that someone with deeper knowledge would find meaningfully incorrect. That gap between plausible and accurate is the productive territory. 'Tis wide enough to require a real correction, and narrow enough that the corrector engages at full depth. The second mechanism is the deliberate gap, where the false assumption works by triggering the correction drive. The deliberate gap works by triggering the completion drive, the near universal human response to incompleteness. You offer an account, a story, an observation, or an explanation that is visibly unfinished, not truncated abruptly, which would signal that something is being withheld, but tapered the way a thought naturally trails when a person is gathering the next piece. You hold the space after the trail. You do not fill it with a question. You simply remain present with the unfinished quality of what you've offered, and you wait. The completion drive is older and more automatic than most people realize. The nervous system experiences incompleteness as mild tension, not distressing, but present. Unresolved narratives, unfinished arguments, open loops in conversation create a low-level cognitive pressure that seeks release through resolution. When someone leaves a gap in a shared conversational space, the easiest resolution is for the other person to fill it. It feels like contribution, not disclosure. It feels like being a good conversational partner. The person filling the gap is not responding to a question. They are participating in a mutual construction of meaning, which is one of the most natural and unguarded things human beings do together. What makes the deliberate gap particularly valuable is what it reveals about prioritization. When someone fills a gap you've left, they choose what to put there, and that choice is not random. It reflects what they consider most relevant, most important, or most present in their model of the situation. You haven't directed their attention, they've directed it themselves. And self-directed attention is almost always more revealing than prompted attention, because it bypasses the filtering that happens when someone is answering a specific question. The gap lets you see what's already at the surface of their thinking, without the distortion produced by framing. The third mechanism is strategic self-disclosure, and it operates on the most fundamental dynamic in human social exchange, reciprocity. The social norm of reciprocal disclosure is one of the most consistent findings in interpersonal psychology. When one person shares something genuine, particularly something that carries mild vulnerability, the other person experiences a pull toward matching it. Not a conscious obligation exactly, but a felt asymmetry that resolves most naturally through a return disclosure of comparable weight. This dynamic is so embedded in social interaction that it operates even between strangers, even in brief exchanges, even when neither person is aware it's happening. Strategic self-disclosure is the deliberate use of this dynamic. You select something genuine to share, not fabricated, because fabricated self-disclosure is detectable and destroys the mechanism it's trying to activate. But selected, you choose to reveal something that is adjacent to the category of information you want to receive. Adjacent, not identical, because offering the exact thing you want back signals your interest and activates the differential again. You share something in the same emotional or informational neighborhood at slightly more depth than the conversation has required. The social contract of mutual vulnerability does the rest. The selection of what to disclose requires precision. A teasal strategic disclosure is something that is genuinely true, slightly more candid than the conversational context demands, non-threatening to the other person's self-concept, and positioned in the category of information you want to receive without being identical to it. It should feel like an offering, like you've extended something, because the reciprocal drive is strongest when the other person experiences what you've given as a gift, rather than a transaction. The moment a disclosure feels like an opening bid, the mechanism weakens. The moment it feels like genuine candor, it strengthens. The fourth mechanism receives the least attention in most treatments of elicitation, and it is the one that binds the others together, the provocative statement. Rather than asking a question or creating a gap, you make an assertion about human behavior, about the subject at hand, about the situation being discussed, that is designed to produce a reaction. The assertion doesn't have to be entirely accurate. It has to be interesting enough, or wrong enough, or close enough to something the person feels strongly about that neutrality becomes uncomfortable. People are not neutral about things they care about. They take positions. In the act of taking a position, defending a view, disagreeing with a premise, correcting an oversimplification, produces exactly the kind of unguarded disclosure that direct questioning shuts down. The provocative statement works because it reframes the conversational dynamic from information exchange to intellectual engagement. It's when someone is arguing a position, they are not managing an impression, they are making a case. Case-making requires evidence, specificity, personal experience, a cane, the kind of detail that never surfaces in carefully managed disclosure. The person isn't giving you information, proving something to you. And the proof, inevitably, contains everything you needed to know. There's a structural principle that underlies all four mechanisms, and it is this. The direction of information flow should always feel like it originates with the other person, not because you have no investment in the outcome, but because the moment your investment becomes visible, the other person's curation instinct engages. You are not a neutral party, but you must produce the behavioral experience of one. This requires a quality of attention that is both genuine and strategically managed. Genuine enough that the other person feels received rather than processed. Managed enough that your reactions don't signal which pieces of what they've said have landed as significant. This is the discipline that separates elicitation from mere conversational technique. The techniques are learnable in an afternoon. The discipline, the ability to receive important information with the same social cadence as receiving unimportant information. To continue the conversation across a significant disclosure as though the transfer were unremarkable, takes considerably longer. It requires the development of what intelligence practitioners call reaction neutrality, the practiced capacity to log without displaying, to register without responding, to hold the weight of what you've just learned without letting that weight change the quality of your presence in the room. Reaction neutrality is difficult precisely because significant information produces a felt response. Interest, surprise, satisfaction, concern, these are genuine states, and genuine states produce behavioral outputs. The elicitor's task is not to eliminate the internal response, but to decouple it from the external expression, to feel the significance and show the ordinary. To maintain the conversational temperature that existed before the disclosure so that the other person has no data point to triangulate against, no moment they can identify afterward as the moment something changed. There is a quality of person that is both the ideal subject for elicitation and the most difficult to elicit from, a cana, and that is the psychologically sophisticated observer, the person who is themselves trained in reading behavior, a cana, or who has developed through experience a finely calibrated sense of when they are being worked. These individuals are not immune to elicitation, but they require a different calibration of it. The false assumption must be more plausible. close enough to accurate that it doesn't trigger the meta-awareness that someone is trying to provoke a correction. The deliberate gap must be more natural, not a conspicuous pause, but a genuine feeling trail. The strategic self-disclosure must be more substantive, because a sophisticated observer will detect thin or tactical vulnerability, and it will cost you more than it earns. What works most reliably with high sophistication subjects is a specific quality of genuine engagement. It's not performed interest. Performed interest is detectable, but actual curiosity about the person's model of the situation. Thus, when you are genuinely curious, the mechanisms operate more cleanly because the social signals that usually accompany them, warmth, attention, the particular quality of presence that makes people feel worth talking to, are real rather than manufactured. The sophisticated person's defenses are calibrated against tactical interaction. They are not calibrated against someone who is both genuinely interested and precisely attentive. A combination is rare enough that it disarms rather than alerts. The application of elicitation extends far beyond intelligence work or high-stakes negotiation. It lives in every conversation where the surface account and the actual situation are not the same, which is most conversations that matter. The professional context where the official story and the real story have diverged. The relationship dynamic where something has shifted and no one has named it. The social situation where information is being managed and you need to understand what's actually present beneath the management. Elicitation is not manipulation in these contexts. It is precision. It's the discipline of getting to what is real without creating the defensive conditions that make real things disappear. What you are developing when you learn this framework is not a set of tricks. It is a quality of conversational presence, the capacity to be genuinely engaged while simultaneously attentive to the structure of what's being offered and withheld. That dual attention is the foundation of every discipline that requires understanding people accurately. Negotiation, therapy, leadership, influence, intimacy. The person who can hold both, who can be fully present with someone while also seeing the architecture of how that person is presenting themselves, has access to a level of understanding that most human beings never develop, because most human beings are too busy being seen to learn how to see. The truth doesn't hide. It circulates, constantly, in the texture of how people speak, what they choose to complete, what they can't resist correcting, what they offer when they feel genuinely met. Elicitation is simply the discipline of being present enough to receive it.